I know that a lot of folks still don't like Epic Games, but I suspect without Geneforge Mutagen being one of their occasional free titles, I would never have learned it exists. I never noticed when it quietly slid onto Steam anyway. When I was a very young kid, we were a Macintosh household, meaning a lot of the popular PC games of the time just weren't available to me. Thankfully, there were a few publishers I remember that would always release on macOS. Pangea Software and Spiderweb Software are the two that sit at the front of my mind. Geneforge was one of Spiderweb's titles. It was a series of 5 games that I used to muddle around in as a kid. Geneforge 1 came out in 2001, when I was 7. And to be fair, I don't think I played it as soon as it came out, but I was definitely younger than 10, so you can imagine I wasn't exactly making great progress. I think the reason that I stuck onto this game and probably replayed the first section 50 times or so was because the whole concept of Geneforge is that you're a shaper, a magical summoner basically, and a quirk of my personality that I've identified over the years is that in any game where it's possible to play as a summoner, I will. All the various RPGs I've played through the years, where possible I've mained a summoner. World of Warcraft, Warlock. Guild Wars, Necromancer. EverQuest 2, Conjurer. Diablo 2, Druid. You get the point, I like to summon stuff. Not sure why, it just works for me. Up until this point, you've been looking at the original Geneforge. What you're seeing now is the remaster that came out last year, which was 2021 if you're watching in the future. In Geneforge 1, you play as a novice shaper stranded on a long-abandoned island that you quickly learn is supposed to be restricted. You don't necessarily know why the shapers left before, but find evidence that it was as a result of some kind of disaster. The place has since been reclaimed by the creations of the shapers who once ruled it. It's a cool idea for a plot, and one that I'm sure I completely ignored as a kid because I just wanted to summon as many things as possible back then. I remember really struggling in the early stages of Geneforge, and I know that Mutagen is a pretty comprehensive remake, not just a graphical overhaul, so maybe it's just because the extra areas and quests bring me to a higher level than I would have been in the original game. Even when there is a relatively hard fight and you do lose a good chunk of health or your creations die, you can just trot back to a village and get yourself back up to full strength before returning. That being said, I am also making fairly liberal use of the quick save and load system, so you know, maybe if I were playing Geneforge on Iron Man mode, I'd be singing a different tune. The Steam page describes it as a complete reworking of every single thing to bring it into the modern era of gaming, and yeah, I can pretty much see that. To some people who would probably call themselves purists, that's a bad thing, and would have probably just preferred an update purely for compatibility and maybe some visuals. But to be honest, I don't really want to get into the comparison too much. When I played Geneforge back in the day, I didn't have the mental capacity to get into it properly, and now that I'm older and my brain has wrinkles, I don't have the patience, so the disappointing outcome is that I'll probably just never bother with the originals, especially if they all get remade. As I write this section, I've played about 20 hours, and was curious exactly how long this game actually is, since I never got even close to finishing it as a kid. I figured I must be about halfway in, and a quick Google says I'm probably right, which would be for the best. I can't see myself playing it for 100 hours, even if I am very interested in the plot. It seems like this is made to be an interactive story more than a tactical RPG, and when I listen to an audiobook, I'd prefer it not to be more than 50 hours long, as that tends to be the crossover point from a good long book that I can settle into, over towards a slog that the author just didn't know how to end. I'll just mention as well that I do intend to finish the game. In case you've not watched my videos before, I'll often say I think it's just as important to talk about how I feel in the early stages in the middle of a game, as how I feel once I'm done with it, whether that's having finished it or just given up. I'm not the sort of person that can forgive a game that's awful for 50 hours because it finished well. People will often say things like, once you get through the first 10 hours, it really livens up. And I've definitely powered through before, but nowadays there's so much I could be doing that if I think I'd be enjoying something else more at a given moment, I'll just go and do that instead. I did already mention that the game hasn't been too challenging so far. But why? No, can't do that one 2 videos in a row. So why isn't it challenging? Essentially, it just boils down to combat being quite mechanically simple. Generally, your creations only have enough action points to move a few tiles and use one ability per turn. And if you're spending all your stat points on improving your creations, then you're not going to be able to do much impressive either. You get a decent variety of buffs and debuffs you can use in battle, but I don't often find myself in the right situation to use them. And often they cost essence, which is the resource that you generally lock up almost all of in your creations anyway. The result is that combat usually just boils down to using your creation's abilities in the obvious way each turn, and preventing them from being killed where necessary. There's not a huge space for tactical innovation. Stylistically, the game's pretty weird. You're surrounded by hooded serviles most of the time. Human-like creations that the Shapers made to perform menial tasks for them. There is something off about them though. Something phallic. They've got flaccid dicks for noses, is what I'm saying. Big ones too, actually. I wonder if they're growers or showers. Your creations range from fire-breathing raptors to floating attack testicles, and go a few places between. There's 3 kinds: fire creations, battle creations, and magic creations. You'd think it'd be pretty obvious what kind of creation fits into each category, but each creation has an improved variant that doesn't always quite fit in. The Fiora gets an ice version, the Cryoa, one of my personal favourite creations for its ice aura. It's just very cool. Cool. And the Thad, a battle creation meant to be your frontline bruiser in the early game, gets an unstable variant that loses health until it explodes on death. I found myself balancing my skill points so far. I suspect it's not the most efficient way to do things, but it's working well enough and it lets me play around with a lot of different combinations of creations. I'm going to go a little bit further into the plot now, so if you're really interested, then maybe jump past this section to the timecode on screen. I mentioned already that you found yourself on a long-abandoned Shaper Island, but you're actually shipwrecked, or Drake-wrecked, by an unidentified vessel. What a classic opening. You find that the penis noses who once served the long-gone Shapers formed into 3 sects with varied ideologies regarding the Shapers after a long 2 centuries on their own. It's interesting. They represent a spectrum from the Obeyers remaining faithful and servile to the Shapers, the Awakened who want to be equals, and the Takers who view the Shapers as oppressors. You meet these sects as well as a group of humans that have taken control of the titular Geneforge, a machine that can rewrite genes to grant them big boy powers, and this turns out to be the reason the island is barred. You learn that the humans are the people who got you stuck here in the first place, and want to use the Geneforge but can't do so without your help. So you can either kill them or help out. One way or another, you get to leave in their boat. As far as I can tell, you do have completely free choice in who you work with. You can just go into combat and start killing at any time. There's more than a dozen endings, but the ultimate result for you is the same, the only difference being the state that you leave the island in. If you just skipped my very quick overview of the plot, then hi, welcome back. To summarise for you, it's a very nice, old-school RPG plot that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. They don't make them like they used to, etc, etc. I get the feeling that if Jeff Vogel weren't a developer, then this and all of the other Spiderweb games would have just been fantasy book series instead. The stories were getting out one way or another, they just happened to be games. Would I recommend you go and play Geneforge Mutagen if you've never heard of it before? Or was it just nostalgia propelling me through? Nah, I'm not really the kind of guy to fall into the rosy glasses of nostalgia. This game is just actually fun and compelling. If I go back and try to play the originals, then I might not be able to get into them so much thanks to the compatibility issues and just generally having to fight with the very old school interface and design. Looks kinda like classic RuneScape. I don't have a great comparison to say something like, if you like X, then you should play Geneforge, but in my opinion it's worth playing. The price on Steam does feel a little high at £15.50p, which I assume is about $20 in the US. If you look at games through the lens of price per hour though, that's still a pretty good deal for the amount of game that's in there. But it's hard for me to evaluate that properly when I swiped it up for free on Epic Games, so you'll have to make that judgment for yourself. I think I just really enjoy the escapism of it. It's a bit of a power trip despite its rudimentary format. For the first half of the game, almost every NPC you approach talks about you fearfully, like a returned scornful god as you roam around with an entourage of summoned monsters. That's all I have to say about it, to be honest. So, thanks for being here. And if you've got to travel, by the 9 divines, stay on the roads. It's the Daedra, you see.